I'll adopt the moniker that my adversaries in Mexico have given me. You will earn it, and the white people will learn it. As the first Native American to portray a native role on television, J. Silverhills created history. As Tanto in The Lone Ranger, he rose to fame. But there was a serious problem behind the scenes. When asked about his most well-known part in 1957, he responded with simply 3 words. Tonto is a moron. The secret wasn't just that. He received half of his white co-star's salary. The moniker Tonto itself indicated something he could never get away from, and he was once physically attacked on set by a director. We're revealing the true story of the man who endured silent suffering while grinning on camera today. J. Harold J. Silverhills was born. Smith on the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve, close to Hagersville, Ontario, May 26, 1912. He was one of 10 or more children living in a tiny home in a large Mohawk family. Alexander George Edwin Smith, his father, was a Kaga war hero who served valiantly at the SNERA during World War I and was awarded the Military Cross. However, he returned home wounded from the war, deafened by artillery, stranded on a farm, and barely making ends meet with $49 a month from the Canadian government. The family wasn't supported by his combat decorations. His wounds never healed. Harold witnessed his daily hearing loss and headaches. His mother, Mabel, was responsible for running the household and was half Seneca and half Mohawk. Doctors refused to see them, so she turned to traditional medicine. Their limited resources were derived from the land, trade, and herbal expertise. Their lives were encircled by poverty from the beginning. Harold was already displaying athletic ability at the age of 5, running around in neighborhood lacrosse games on the reserve. Under the name Harry Smith, he was playing box lacrosse professionally for the Toronto Tumps by the age of 19. He wasn't by himself. He was traveling through Buffalo, Rochester, Atlantic City, and beyond with his brothers and cousins, Porky, Beef, and Chubby. Through the 1930s, they played almost constantly, making money, avoiding destitution, and establishing a reputation. Harold was given the nickname Silverheels, as he ran past a defender so fast that it appeared as though his shoes flashed silver. It became stuck. It was picked up by newspapers. Just to see him run, fans turned out. Coaches began designating 2 players specifically to guard him after he scored more than 4 goals per game one season. However, being a famous athlete did not grant them access to the system. While Harold was growing up, residential schools in Canada attempted to eradicate Indigenous languages. Students who spoke Mohawk were thrashed in Six Nations. Some were strapped or given soap. After attending a residential school, Harold's own sister returned, unable to communicate well in her native tongue. Policies that punished their spirituality, prohibited ceremonies, and forced them into quiet tore families apart. They were referred to as lazy by officials. They claimed they were incapable of competing. That message persisted not only in reports, but also in daily interactions, in the way people treated them, discussed them, and looked at them. In the 1930s, Harold's family, like many others, fell farther into the Great Depression. They relocated to Buffalo. Harold did whatever it required, including odd jobs and farm labor. Even though he was a distinguished veteran, his father had discomfort when he moved. In order to obtain food, his mother traded away family heirlooms. Rations provided by the government frequently went bad. In order to keep the lights on, Harold witnessed his parents sacrifice everything. Poverty like that did more than simply hurt the stomach. People felt as though they were non-existent as a result. Harold yet pressed on. On the lacrosse field, his quickness opened doors. He turned pro in 1932, earning $75 each game, a significant sum of money during the Great Depression. Harold was suspended for his blows after an altercation that started after a hard foul in a Montreal game. However, ticket sales soared after his return. Despite the potential for controversy, people wanted to see him. He garnered media attention. He continued. Boxing followed. Harold competed in Madison Square Garden's Golden Gloves tournament as a middleweight. He advanced to the semifinals before suffering a severe blow to the jaw that resulted in 2 fractures. His aspirations of boxing were dashed by the injuries, but he survived thanks to the prize money. On a liquid diet, he lost about 25 pounds, but he continued. He learned how to endure pain and keep going from that battle. He took his lacrosse team on a visit of Los Angeles in 1937. Comedian Joe E. Brown saw him running at Gilmore Stadium one day and gave him a short film role. It took Harold 11 attempts to perfect a diving catch that he did as a stunt. He received $150. Lacrosse paid twice that amount. After that, things changed. He began referring to himself as J. Silverheels after receiving a Screen Actors Guild card, and by the end of the year, he had made 5 appearances. He was in, but he wasn't a star. The red carpet was not rolled out by Hollywood. In order to make ends meet, he worked as a stuntman for less than $20 per day and busted tables at night. However, in 1939, he was cast in a real role in Drums Along the Mohawk. He had never earned more than $350 a week from it. The name Silverheels appealed to the studios. They believed it sounded exotic and advised him to use it formally. He played largely unidentified Indians in modest roles. He was stripped down to the waist by casting directors as if he were on exhibit. They gave his body a higher rating than his acting. Nevertheless, he continued to acquire jobs, showed up, and memorized his lines. He eventually received a speaking role in 1941. He had portrayed Indian Scout or Warrior No. 2 in over 15 films by that point, most of them without credit. He never quit up, though. At first, he didn't think Shakespeare was for him. But he learned because a friend told him, "If you can read this, you can read anything." Although there are few records, he served throughout World War II. He returned to Hollywood in 1945 with the new moniker J. Silvers. However, little had changed in the industry. White actors in makeup continued to be prioritized over native actors. There weren't many roles, and the ones that were offensive. He starved himself in order to make his suit fit when he tried out for Captain from Castile in 1946. As usual, the director forced him to remove his shirt. He got the part, but it was embarrassing. Despite the movie's financial failure, he was employed. Even when he did have lines, he was not given credit. With his lacrosse team, he traversed the South, where bigotry was pervasive and unavoidable. He was turned away by hotels. He would not be served in restaurants. While his white teammates were given lodgings, he slept on buses. He was threatened by cops in Louisville for simply using a whites-only restroom. These occurrences weren't uncommon. They never changed. Because of this, he fought for greater roles and representation in Hollywood later in life when he finally got a platform. It took 10 years for anyone to take notice of him. That changed in 1948 when he was paired with Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Beale in Key Largo by director John Huston. Jay portrayed the iconic fugitive Tom Osceola. At last, an acknowledged part in a big-budget motion picture. For 78 days, they filmed it on the Warner Brothers back lot in Burbank, creating Florida in a controlled setting to save money. For Jay, however, it meant emerging from the shadows. Not simply another name in the credits anymore. Jay was cast in Broken Arrow, a Western that was supposed to be progressive, but was unable to completely abandon its traditional customs. 2 years later, in 1950. Although he wasn't the lead, he performed the strong part of Geronimo. That went to Jeff Chandler, a Brooklyn-based white actor who played coochies with black makeup. Hollywood couldn't bring itself to allow Native actors to take the lead, even in a movie that attempted to portray Native Americans more properly. Background extras were real Apaches from the Fort Apache Reservation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but Jay, a Canadian Mohawk, gave Geronimo dignity. Then came the event that altered both his life and the course of television. When The Lone Ranger debuted on ABC in 1949, Silvers defeated 35 other performers to get the role of Tonto. On September 15th, it was broadcast. A Native American actor portrayed a Native American character on television for the first time. White men such as Roland Parker and John Todd have narrated Tonto's radio version for 20 years. TV producers were hesitant even when they thought about using a native actor. For refusing to use broken English, one person was dismissed. After returning to John Todd, they eventually offered Jay the position. Hollywood's standard at the time was to make Italian actors appear sufficiently native by painting them with Armenian bowl red clay. That pattern was broken by Jay's casting. Everything changed when he won the part, even though he wasn't intended to. The name was a constant source of trouble. In Spanish, Tanto denotes fool or dumb. Silverhills was aware of it. He put up with it. He grinned in public. He hated it in private. He was questioned about his well-known position in 1957 when on a visit to his native reserve in Ontario. he responded quickly. Tanto is a moron. 3 words. And that was all he said. However, 10 years of silent annoyance lay beneath those statements. Despite criticism from Native American organizations for being disrespectful, the name persisted over the years. The topic reappeared in 2013 when Johnny Depp played Tanto. There had been no change. It wasn't simply the name either. Jay was notoriously bad at reading his lines. The lines were frequently written in poor, stiff, fractured English to sound authentic, not because he was lazy. He would ad-lib. He would invent it. "I'm waiting here. You enter the city." "That's correct." The words stuck. The directors were incensed. In 1955, Alan Dinhart recalled that one director, Wilhelm Thiele, became so furious that he had to be restrained physically from assaulting Jay on the set. The Lone Ranger himself, Clayton Moore, however, stood up for his co-star. He would respond, "Let it play. It has a more organic sound." Jay was right. Hollywood didn't want him to know how people actually spoke. He felt compelled to provide the stereotype they requested. It wasn't much better behind the scenes. Cuts were made because each episode had a meager $2,500 budget. In the beginning, Jay and Moore lacked even adequate dressing rooms. Down the road, they had to use a restroom at a gas stop to change. Particularly in Chadsworth, where the suede and wool garments became ovens, the heat on set was unbearable. Jay had had enough. He waited there waiting one day, refusing to get dressed. Jay refused to change his mind despite Moore's warning that postponing the shoot may cost him jobs. Private dressing rooms emerged the following day. Although it was a minor victory, it had significance. Jay could have simply embraced the celebrity. Now he was a star. One of the most popular television programs was The Lone Ranger. In Nielsen ratings for the 1955-51 season, it came in at number 7 and remained in the top 30 for years. They produced 221 episodes over 8 seasons. Jay, however, never forgot the price. Tanto had turned into something he didn't like. Being the sidekick who often spoke in fragments annoyed him. He was smart, articulate, and fluent. However, the show prevented him from being that. The program was abruptly stopped by a fear. A stuntman landed on Jay during a fight scene practice in 1955. Moore noticed a problem. Jay had an odd gait. He discovered him clutching his chest after following him to the trailer. Heart attack. Even though Jay was a Golden Gloves boxer, a lacrosse champion, and an athlete, he smoked a lot. He recuperated for 8 weeks. Dan Reed, a new character, was brought in to cover the void at that period. Tanto's disappearance was interpreted by writers as a result of his encounter with the Great White Father in Washington. They didn't comprehend how much that line said. Jay was just Harold Smith at home. In 1945, he wed Mary Doma, with whom he had 4 children, Karen, Pamela, Marilyn, and Jay Jr. He had 2 children from his previous marriage to Bobby Smith, Steve and Gail. He made a joke about their mixed ancestry. He once claimed on The Tonight Show that he married an Italian to exact revenge on Christopher Columbus and referred to their children as indolens. However, there was more to the joke than that. The Mohawk chief had been Jay's grandpa. He was raised in Ontario on the Six Nations Reserve. The truth he carried with him was very different from Hollywood's portrayal of Indian. Jay Silverhills played a Kiowa chief named Satanta in the 1953 movie War Arrow. Although it wasn't a leading role, he was cast with well-known actors like Jeff Chandler and Maureen O'Hara. Filming took place from early March to April at locations throughout Arizona, including Nallas and Sonita's Empire Ranch, as well as a few sequences in Agoura, California. Director George Sherman ultimately reduced what had begun as a strong action western by removing a number of action scenes and substituting them with talkie segments that described the action rather than depicting it. Later on, even the studio acknowledged that this choice detracted from the movie. Nevertheless, it had impressive stunt sequences and vibrant Technicolor images. Chandler was pleasant, according to Maureen O'Hara, but she wasn't impressed by his acting. As a reminder of how native positions were typically positioned, just out of the spotlight but yet there, Silverhill's character stood on the other side of the main battle. He appeared in Drums Across the River in a supporting capacity the next year, in 1954. This time, he portrayed T.A. in a Nathan Duran-directed Western that starred Audie Murphy. It was filmed in Technicolor in some of the most picturesque locations in California. such as Red Rock Canyon and Barton Flats. Murphy portrayed a young man who was being held accountable for a crime he didn't commit while attempting to avert a conflict with the Ute tribe. Background was only one aspect of Silverhills' involvement. In a tale about land conflicts and escalating tensions, his character spoke for the indigenous people. The film was notable for its dramatic action scenes, horseback riding, and what one critic described as a jump of death stunt. Silverheels, a former boxer and lacrosse player, was accustomed to these kinds of physical scenes. In a production that cost about $1 million, a significant sum at the time, Morris Ankrum appeared on screen. Beside him as Chief Urey, Silverhills made a comeback as Tanto in 2 motion picture adaptations after The Lone Ranger series concluded in 1956 and ceased broadcasting by 1957. The Lost City of Gold followed in 1958, followed by The Lone Ranger in 1956. The second movie, which lasted 81 minutes, was produced by United Artists in Eastman Color. He performed with Clayton Moore. The movie performed well once more. Not a failure, but also not a hit. What followed was what really got to me. He was famous because of his role as Tanto, but it also constrained him. Since then, the majority of the native roles he was offered were identical, frequently thin, and cliched. His alternatives gradually dried up due to the typecasting. He continued to appear in TV guest spots and westerns throughout the 1960s. Characters from Wagon Train, Wanted, Dead or Alive, Rawhide, Laram, Daniel Boone, and the Virginia are nearly always the same. He hardly ever received the credit or diversity he merited, even when he gave strong performances. Between 1964 and 1965, he appeared on Daniel Boone 3 times, albeit in parts that hardly featured any conversation. He made roughly $100,000 a season while filming The Lone Ranger, which is equivalent to nearly $850,000 in today's currency, but that was still just half of Clayton Moore's salary. He spent the most of his career with that compensation disparity. The native rights movement developed along with the 1960s. Along with it came criticism from native communities rather than from Hollywood. Activists began pointing out how Tanto and other native characters perpetuated outdated prejudices. Russell Means, a leader of the American Indian movement, used Tonto as an insult, similar to how Uncle Tom was used in black communities, while another scholar referred to it as an Indian step-in-fetch. Silverhills was torn between the image his celebrity was based on and the fame he had gained. He began to fade from the screen, not because he wanted to, but rather because studios and networks began to fear criticism. He was vulnerable to climate change, notwithstanding his prior accomplishments. However, he turned towards something more enduring rather than fading away or being silent. He was a co-founder of the Indian Actors Workshop in Los Angeles in the beginning of the 1960s. With assistance from Buffy Saint, it began at the L.A. Indian Center. Rod Redwing, Iron Eyes Cody, and Marie. With weekly lessons and a location for local actors to practice, train, and advance their skills, it had established itself as a true staple by 1966. Michael Horse, who later portrayed Tonto in The Legend of the Lone Ranger in 1981 and rose to fame for his role in Twin Peaks, was one of those aspiring performers. According to Silver, 1973, their primary objective was to awaken the latent creativity within indigenous people. He built it, not just said it. Jay Silverhills married Bobby Smith in the late 1930s while he was employed in Hollywood as a background actor and stuntman. By 1943, their marriage had broken down. At the same time, he was balancing erratic film employment and World War II military service, frequently on the road doing risky stunts for movies like Western Union and The Seahawk, making barely enough money to survive on between $50 and $75 per week. His 2 children, Steve and a daughter whose name fluctuates in the records, sometimes appearing as Gail and other times as Sharon, were separated from him as a result of the divorce. It was almost impossible for Jay to maintain regular communication with them because of his meager wages, frequent travel, and the legal issues associated with serving during the war. Jay once made a joke about marrying Mary Doma, an Italian-American woman, in order to exact revenge on Christopher Columbus. He married her a few years later in 1945 or 1946. He referred to their children as Indelians. They settled in Canoga Park, California, and had 4 kids: Jay Jr., Marilyn, Pamela, and Karen. Jay was cast as Tanto in The Lone Ranger in 1949, a role that would come to define his public persona. He gained notoriety but not wealth as a result. Tanto was both a breakthrough and a trap, because contracts at the time didn't offer much in the way of long-term remuneration, and because it was so heavily typecast. He continued to be confined to characters that sounded and looked like Tanto even after the show's 1957 finale. His already precarious financial situation was made worse in 1955 when he suffered a heart attack during filming and missed 8 weeks of work. Nevertheless, despite all the highs and lows of a lengthy and precarious career, he and Mary stayed together until his passing. He started to consider how Native Americans were portrayed in Hollywood by the early 1960s, and more significantly, who had the opportunity to do so. He began covertly endorsing the Indian Actors Workshop, a concept that would take official shape in 1966. It was his method of taking action rather than voicing his disapproval from the outside. Boycotts, in his opinion, would not benefit Native Americans the way they had African Americans, claiming that an Indian boycott would not result in the financial damage that a black boycott might. He thus concentrated on training, which he could control. Jay trained budding Native actors in acting, voice acting, stunt skills, and even nutrition alongside Noble Kid Chisel and William Bassett. They met once a week at locations such as a Methodist church in Echo Park and the Los Angeles Indian Center, helping Native actors join the Screen Actors Guild, acquire better roles, and gradually change how studios viewed them was the obvious objective. This strategy was not well received by everyone. Russell Means and other activists viewed Tonto as an embodiment of all the issues with Native representation. In activist circles, the term Tonto even became a pejorative, and the character was ridiculed as an Indian step and get it. However, Jay stayed on course. He thought that getting people through the gates, rather than shouting at them, would bring about genuine change. He even launched a letter-writing campaign to senior TV executives, President Eisenhower and Vice President Nixon, calling for improved Native American representation on screen. The session also addressed more general community concerns, such as elder care and alcohol misuse. Acting wasn't the only thing involved. It had to do with survival, pride, and identity. When the 1970s arrived, Jay decided to pursue harness racing as a second career. He coached horses at Hollywood Park and obtained a provisional driver's license in 1974. When he went on tour back east in 1973 and 1974, his reputation helped promote races, and he liked running them around the track. In 1996, Hijo Silverheels, one of the horses he was later rewarded with, set a new track record at Los Alamitos. It was witnessed by Jay's son, Jay Jr., and his widow, Mary. But Jay was long gone by then. He was about to be offered more important and respectable parts in 1975 when he had a string of strokes that left him partially handicapped. His speech was seriously impacted by another big stroke in 1976. Months before he passed away on July 17, 1979, he was awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Among the indigenous dancers, he attended in a wheelchair. He was hardly able to utter a few words of gratitude. For a man whose deeds had spoken so loudly, it was a silent, bittersweet moment. Jay passed away at the age of 67 from pneumonia and stroke-related complications at a Calabasas hospital on March 5, 1980. His ashes were returned to his birthplace, the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, after he was cremated. His son, Jay Silverhills Jr., continued the family tradition by pursuing a career in acting. In 1981, he starred in The Legend of the Lone Ranger, a movie so beset by production problems that it became a Hollywood cautionary tale. There was a media frenzy when the lead actor's voice had to be dubbed since original Lone Ranger actor Clayton Moore was legally prohibited from donning the character's mask in public. The star of the movie never performed again because of how badly it did. Nevertheless, Jay Jr. persisted in his career in television, attempting to follow in his father's footsteps by being proud, prominent, and advocating for improved roles for Native actors. When Jay formally established the Indian Actors Workshop in 1966, He stated that its primary goal was to awaken the Indians' latent creativity. That inventiveness wasn't dormant for long. Native performers like Graham Greene, who received an Oscar nomination for Dances with Wolves and movies like Smoke Signals in 1998, were influenced by the workshop in the years following his passing. Native Americans wrote, directed, and produced the first motion picture. Both the history of Native cinema and the concrete of Hollywood bear Jay's name. Under the name Harry Tanto Smith, he was posthumously admitted into the Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame in 1997 and the Western Performers Hall of Fame in 1993. The Shays Performing Arts Center in Buffalo still has his photo on display. Every Indigenous storyteller who chooses to speak, act, and write on their own terms and wants more than stereotypes is influenced by him. And he never allowed resentment to stop him, despite the fact that he once admitted that he cringed inside each time he had to deliver Tanto's terrible English lines. Jay Silverhills knew how to take back the stage even when the lines weren't his own. In 1969, he came out as Tanto on The Tonight Show, facing the camera and declaring, "My name is Tanto. I hail from Toronto, and I speak Esperanto."